Hey there everyone, this is Leo from TechLine, once again bringing yet another commission build on my channel, and this time it's going to be two firsts for the builds that I'm putting out over to here. One is going to be the first time that we're going to be building a system using an AMD 7000 series processor, so the brand new platform that AMD has been using, but it's also going to be the first time we're going to be using custom cable sleeves for the power supplies, these times going to be brought to you by FormulaMod. So let's gonna go pop open everything that we have over here and get this PC all built up together. But before we do that, this video is brought to you by us over at TechLinePCs.com, where you can check out our store for custom mid-range builds, along with our consolation page, where you can fill in whether you'd like an upgrade, a new build, a pre-built PC, along with a budget, and we'll work with you on the PC of your choice. Check us out again over at TechLinePCs.com. So this customer of ours wanted specifically a couple of parts that they already picked out ahead of time, and they just wanted us to build a PC that made it all work together. The first thing was going to be an AMD Ryzen 5 7600 processor, and the video card that they chose was going to be the XFX AMD Radeon 6750 XT. I tried to push them over towards a 6800 XT because I think it's a much better card for the value, but their budget didn't allow for something to go that high. And lastly, they wanted to have themselves a bunch of cable sleeves from FormulaMod with the colors of blue, white, and black. So that's what we're going to be throwing in all together over here on this build. Now, of course, first we're going to start off with the motherboard setup, and this time we're going to go with the MSI Pro B650P Wi-Fi motherboard. And the main reason we also went for this board is because it came with a combo deal with the AMD Ryzen 5 7600. It's always wise to keep looking out for those combo deals that you could find on sites like Amazon and Newegg, because it really does help bring the price down of a total system. Next, what we're going to do is going to get the memory set up onto the motherboard. Now, being that they're working on the AM5 platform now, this is going to be DDR5 memory. So we no longer are going to be using DDR4 memory like we've used in our other builds. It's going to be a newer type, newer slots, and much faster memory speeds. So the one that we have over here is going to be the Corsair Vengeance 32 gig kit of DDR5 5600 memory. It's going to be an all black kit, so it's going to fit just well with the motherboard that we're using, and it's going to slot in just fine into the motherboard without an issue. Now for storage, of course, you're going to go with at least 1 terabyte of storage. This is going to be an M.2 drive from Samsung, the 970 EVO Plus. Now this isn't going to be the 980, which sure is a faster drive, but considering this is just going to be a gaming system, 3,500 megabytes per second of read speed is going to be more than fast enough for what we're going with over here. Now the motherboard does require just a little bit of setup. There happens to be the standoff inside one of the bags that's over here. We just need to screw it into the 80mm length area that's on it. And once that's on there, we could just pop on the M.2 drive and slap it on with a little plastic clip. And then we can screw on the metal cover that's on it to make sure that it's nice and secured. Now the last piece of motherboard setup that we're going to be doing here is going to be the processor, and this time we went with the AMD Ryzen 5 7600. This is a 6-core 12-thread processor that can boost up to 5.1 gigahertz. Now this is part of their new AM5 socket that started around at the end of last year, and the cool part about this is that it's no longer going to be using the pins that are on the back of the processor and stuff. Instead, it's going to be much like the way Intel's been doing it for many generations at this point, where the pins are going to be built onto the motherboard as opposed to the processor. So it's going to look completely flat on the back of the actual processor, but that does mean that we have to be a little bit more careful when we're going to be installing it on the motherboard. Back on the motherboard side, we could see the slot that it's actually going to be going in. So we lift up the lever and we take off the lid, and we could see the area that the processor is going to go in. Now we could easily find how it's going to be installed. As you can see, these little cutouts on the side, plus this arrow in the top left corner. So we just make sure that the arrows align, place the processor inside, close the lid on top of it, and then we pull the lever down and we hear a snap. And that's how we know that the processor's in there firmly. Now with these three major components installed onto the motherboard, I always take this time to kind of just give the board itself a once over to make sure that everything is installed in there properly and everything is fitting just the way that it should. This is also kind of the time where I kind of just want to make a quick checklist before we start installing everything back over into the case that we're going to be opening up itself. Now normally I would also put in the fan onto the processor at this point, but we're going to be using a tower cooler here, and I find that it's much easier to install tower coolers after the fact, as we're going to be dealing with some cable management that we're going to be using on the board itself, and I don't want the tower to get into the way of the power cables, but we'll get to that in a few moments. Speaking of the case, the one that we're going to be using here will be the Fractal Design Pop Air Mid-Tower case. This is going to be their all-black variant with a tempered glass window. We've actually used a couple of the Fractal Pop Air cases on our channel at this point, and honestly for the $80 that this case costs, it's just a really good deal considering that it already comes with 3 pre-installed Fractal fans, and on top of that, it's very easy to work in. Ample space in the back and very good cable management already built into the case with a bunch of zip ties and Velcro places that we could really work with over here. So we're just going to make sure that we get everything cut open and just lay the case out so that way we can start working with putting the motherboard inside. With the case itself already opened up and the panels removed, we laid it down over onto its back and we can actually start getting the motherboard itself installed into the case. The first thing we'll do is get the I/O shield installed onto the case. It's as simple as just simply lining it up with the hole that we have over to the back, push it in until we hear a couple of clicks and make sure that it's standing in place. As for the motherboard, there's actually a little standoff nub that we can put the motherboard right onto that'll hold it in place on the case itself, which is very convenient during these kind of installations. So we go ahead and slide it in and it pops right onto the case, and then we just screw it down to all the available screw ports that are on the motherboard to make sure it's very well secured onto the case. For the power supply, we went with another Corsair product, the RM750E fully modular power supply. Now this is slightly above the wattage that the RX6650 XT was asking for, but it has all the ports that we'll need to plug in everything in this kit. Most importantly, we absolutely need to have ourselves a fully modular kit since we're going to be installing custom cables, so it's going to be necessary for us for saving space. We'll just set aside the cables that we'll need for the motherboard power, the 2 8-pins for the CPU, and the 2 8-pin PCI Express connectors. Afterwards, what we'll do is we'll plug them into the power supply one by one and then slide it into the cage at the bottom of the case, and then we'll screw it in over here and keep all the cables aside. And now for our special edition here, the custom cables by FormulaMod. Now these are going to be a set of blue, black, and white cables specifically chosen by my customer, as they wanted to give their PC a splash of color, and I was more than happy to oblige them for it. So for these, we're going to take out the same cables that we took out for our power supply, the motherboard, CPU, and PCI Express connectors, along with these plastic separators that we'll need to help keep them clean and organized when we put them a bit later during the cable management portion of this whole build. Now the FormulaMod cables install pretty easily onto the end of the Corsair cables, so we just snap them in one at a time, and then we begin feeding them through the proper areas of the case. From there, we can go ahead and plug them each into the motherboard, and we'll leave the PCI Express cables dangling for now, as we're going to use those once the graphic card gets installed. With the cables fully snaked through and mostly plugged in, we can begin working on getting the cooler applied. The one we went with here to help match the aesthetic theme of the build is going to be the DeepCool AK400 Zero Dark Dual Fan Tower Cooler. Though the 7600 does come with a capable Wraith cooler in the box, we wanted to have something with a bit more extra oomph in there for another level of cooling performance in this build. The AK400 Zero Dark is incredibly cheap for the level of performance that it offers, coming in at just under $40. And this one came in with 4 copper heat pipes and 2 120mm fans, along with a kit to have it mount properly onto an AM5 motherboard. It also comes with some adapters that we can easily daisy chain the 2 fans to one another, so that way we don't have to use up all the fan pins that are on the motherboard. We'll first start by removing the plastic brackets from the motherboard itself. Next, we'll go ahead and screw in these provided risers by hand where the brackets are going to be used. Afterwards, we'll go ahead and take in this square metal bracket that the AK400 came with and mount this onto the riser with a couple of screws that's on there to make sure that this is going to be nice and secured onto the motherboard. Now, I went ahead and already removed the fans in advance so we can get the tower cooler itself mounted onto the motherboard. It already comes with pre-applied thermal paste, so we won't really have to use any more extra than what's already provided over here, and we'll just go ahead and mount this onto the bracket using the 2 screws that are built onto the cooler. With the tower cooler fully mounted onto the motherboard, we'll need to just get the 220mm fans mounted. First, as it's way easier to do this now than after the fans are installed, we'll go ahead and plug the fans into the CPU header on the motherboard. Afterwards, we'll use the provided clips to snap the fans into the tower cooler fins. And now the tower cooler is fully ready to keep this 7600 nice and chilly. And as always, the final piece of a build, this thick boy itself here, the XFX Radeon RX6750 XT. Also a card that was specifically requested by my customer, this GPU can rock games all types out there at 1080p, medium, and high settings, and even push a lot of them to 1440p as well. Rocking 12GB of GDDR6 video memory with boost clocks of up to 2623 MHz. Cooling it's going to be this sleek 3-fan design, so we're not going to have to worry about it getting any spicy on us. As for its outputs, it's going to be utilizing a trio of DisplayPort 1.4 ports along with a single HDMI 2.1 port, so it is capable of outputting higher refresh rate 4K video. Even though GPUs are generally the biggest component these days, they are still some of the easiest to install. The only thing that we'll have to do is take out the two covers from the back of the case, and then we'll simply line it up with the provided PCI Express port and push it in until we hear it click into place. Then we screw it down so that it's fully mounted. Lastly, we'll just snag the two FormulaMod cables for power and plug them right on in. And with that, this customer's PC is now fully built. Now, all we need to do for this commission is just to do a BIOS upgrade, get Windows installed, and do a small test on the system just to make sure that it's cooling properly and that all the parts are functional. Now, we're not going to be doing a full benchmark suite, as this is mostly just for a customer's commission, but we're still going to go over a couple of numbers for what you can expect out of a build like this. First, with just a pair of Battle Royale titles, I did start off with Apex Legends, which was giving me on average at about 260 FPS at 1080p, the highest settings that the games have available. So if you have a 240Hz monitor, it can absolutely play at this resolution and at that refresh rate, and even at 1440p if you have a 120Hz display. Fortnite, which you have here on screen right now, was also running at 1080p on epic settings, and I was getting an incredibly playable 120 FPS experience over here. You could turn it down to high if you're looking for a bit more FPS, but I think this is just fine for the average gamer. And I did throw in a single player title in there just for good measure. I went through the Resident Evil 4 remake at 1080p maximum settings, averaged at around 80 FPS during the opening sequences. As far as cooling, the hottest that I saw the CPU get during all this play was around 55 degrees Celsius, whereas the GPU hovered at around 60 degrees Celsius at most, so the heat really is the least of this build's concerns. With all that fully done and tested, the only thing that we have left to do is just get some cable management done to make sure that it's completely presentable to my client. So what we can do is use the plastic guides that were provided with the FormulaMod cables to make sure that they're sneaking through the system in a nice and clean way. Lastly, we'll just use some Velcro, zip, and twist ties to all the cables that are in the back, plus shoving a couple of other extras into the bay area down below, and then the system from there is fully built and ready to be shipped out. Now, I'm incredibly happy with the way that this system turned out. This is the first time that I got to use an AM5 part on one of our commissions along with DDR5 memory, plus it's the first time that we've used custom cables with this as well. This system isn't a beacon of light with RGBs all over it, and it still looks absolutely incredible with this color scheme. If you or anyone you know might be interested in one of our pre-made PCs or getting a commission done for themselves, please don't hesitate to ask and send me a message through our YouTube channel or through any of our social feeds, or check out our website over at techlionpcs.com. Now make sure to like and subscribe for more PC builds and gaming hardware news. Until next time, this is Leo signing out.